Welcome. I'm Danny Bartlett, the Executive Director of Advocacy for the Gender Coalition of Ontario. And I'm acknowledging as a settler from a long line of settlers, the land on which I sit is the traditional territory of Oneida Nations of the Thames, the people of the Standing Stone. Locally, the territories that are closest to me and with deep respect I acknowledge, the Anishinaabe people, also referred to as the Three Fires Confederacy, including the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, the Haudenosaunee people, also known as the Iroquois, the Six Nation, including Mohawk, Oneida, Cayuga, Odanaga, Seneca, and Tukura, and the Lenape people, also referred to as the Delaware or the Munsee. Today in the province of Ontario, there are 127 First Nation communities. 75 of them have a boil water advisory. The Nestagaga Nation, which is in the northern part of our province, is on day 9,632 of a boil water advisory. It's well over 25 years old. After the news of the past few weeks, being a settler from a long line of settlers means something different to me. Something which I'm going to have to lean into, take some time with, and figure out what it means for me specifically. 215, now well over 500, and we are sure there will be many, many, many more stolen, murdered, undocumented, lost souls of children weigh heavy on my soul. It changes the way I feel about my heritage and this country. I'm coming to terms with this yet. But I will not, in my discomfort, look away. I understand that this information has been known by the Indigenous people I call friends, neighbors, and partners, and my ignorance, in fact, is a failure to those relationships. But I know now, and I have no need to defend that horror. I understand that it is genocide, and that will demand that those in power will name it so. I will then move ahead to strengthen my relationships. Oneida the Thames First Nation Chief Adrian Christian and Chippewa the Thames First Nation Chief Jacqueline French have called for further investigations at our area Mount Elgin Residential School, and the coalition adds a voice and considerable weight to the chief's call in solidarity for this to happen. Tonight we are talking about toxic masculinity, something else like poverty and homelessness that was brought to this land by the colonizers so many generations ago. We now see why it is so important for us to understand the long-standing history that has brought us to reside on these Indigenous lands. It is a long history of broken promises, miseducation, and not listening, and clearly genocide. We are committed to truth and reconciliation with our Indigenous neighbors, friends, and community partners. We recognize that individually and collectively, we all have a role to play in demanding that the treaties are honored or that the land goes back, and contributing to reconciliation. It is my opinion, after years of inaction, dirty water, missing daughters, and broken promises, and now the crimes of residential school system, that the federal government needs to recompense the First Nation people of Turtle Island. Welcome.
Thanks, Danny. Hi, everyone. Welcome tonight. We're just going to take care of one little piece of business. Jordan, sorry, I forgot to make you co-host. Now you're co-host, so you should be able to admit people while we're chatting. Thank you. My bad. We're so pleased to have you here tonight, and we want to begin tonight's session with a little bit of information about the coalition itself. And so I'm going to share my screen here for a moment. And let's just make that. So the coalition sorry, that's our old title. I should have changed that. It's the Gender Equality Coalition of Ontario. And we are supported by CFUW London, which is the Canadian Federation of University Women of London. That's our founding organization. And Wage Canada, Women and Gender Equality Canada. So we were started with a funding grant from Wage Canada. We have a coalition leadership team, or what most places call their board, and many of us are on the call tonight. These are some of the names of folks that are part of the coalition and the leadership team. We are trying to support the Sustainable Development Goal of number 5, which is gender equality. And we believe that we have to limit the beliefs, the stereotypes and barriers in the home, the workplace, education, government, and all areas of our society. So that is our main goal. We want to do that through a life cycle model. And so we will look at a cradle to grave situation where do these limiting role stereotypes develop in childhood, through the school system, in the workforce, through our careers, into heading into retirement and all aspects of life. And so that's how we will tackle the problem going forward. We believe that using a collective voice for our vision is create a community where everyone enjoys the opportunities, responsibilities, and the rewards equally, unrestricted by gender identity. Our plan is to connect with local businesses, community organizations, municipal governments, school boards, and citizens. So basically everyone in the London area to become members, to become part of the voice, to become part of the solution, and help to identify what are the barriers to equality, create strategies for change, and use our collective voice in this coalition to call for gender justice. Right now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Matthew Sereda. Matthew will be introducing our speaker tonight. Matthew is a coalition board member, and he is also the Equity and Inclusion Education Learning Coordinator for the Thames Valley District School Board. Previously, Matthew acted as the Safe School Learning Coordinator for the Thames Valley School Board and helped to create and implement the School Within a College program. The Thames Valley School Board initiative designed to re-engage students who had previously dropped out of high school. Matthew is the recipient of the Alosa Peace Award for his work towards truth and reconciliation with the See Me project, a program designed to teach students about Canada's residential schools system and how timely is that with all that's been happening, and the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Matthew is also a recipient of the Prime Minister's Award for Teaching Excellence for his work with the School Within a College program. And so without any further ado, I'll turn this now over to Matthew.
Well, thank you for that, Linda. It's so lovely to be here with everybody. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for this evening, Jeff Perera. I have a short bio to read for Jeff, but before I read that bio, I just wanted to share a couple personal anecdotes about my experience working with Jeff. So I had the privilege of first meeting Jeff about 10 years ago when I was very new in my role as a learning coordinator for the Thames Valley District School Board. And it was because of how inspired I was by Jeff's words and his commitment to not only end violence against women and girls, but also to talk to boys and men about their role in that conversation. And from my first meeting with Jeff, really, as a school board, we've had the tremendous opportunity to embed a lot of the initiatives that Jeff is going to speak to us about tonight. So on a personal level, Jeff, I really wanted to say thank you. And now to the prepared bio. So Jeff is a speaker, writer, and facilitator on topics around men and masculinity. He has spoken to tens of thousands of people across North America and has delivered 2 TEDx talks on subjects related to the construction of gender, helpful versus harmful ideas of manhood, empathy building, and men helping end gender-based violence. Whether in the workplace, on campus, the locker room, or on his own website, higherunlearning.com, Jeff creates spaces for discussion and inspiring men and boys to become models of possibilities for others. So with that, Jeff, I turn it over to you, my friend. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for that warm introduction. And thank you to everybody for joining us. And thank you to the Gender Equality Coalition for having me share space with you this evening. I'm really excited to have this important conversation with you all and share space with you all to discuss after I say a few words off the top here. And again, if you want to find out more about the work that I do and content that I provide, higherunlearning.com is the space for that. I just off the top, I want to also acknowledge Indigenous women, Muslim women, their laughter, wisdom, insight have been very influential for me on a personal and professional level in my journey of learning and unlearning. And I'm thinking of survivors of residential schools and the enormous loss of lives, loss of culture for Indigenous peoples across Canada and the land defenders. And so thankful as a settler to have the opportunity to speak and share words with you this evening. And we're here to talk a bit about this idea of what it means to be a man and what makes a man, the conversations that we need to have amongst men and young men and with them in our lives, again, on a personal or professional level, how harmful versus helpful ideas of manhood impact us all, and how, as I like to say, how we can be the lesson in action and models of possibility of what it can look like moving forward through our lives. And to do that, I say that we need to draw new maps to manhood, new ideas of what it can look like to be a man throughout society today. There's more than one way to be a man, of course, but whatever that path looks like for the men and boys in your life or for yourself, it's about being positive and having positive paths versus harmful shortcuts towards your idea of manhood. It's about having the tough discussions, developing respect, empathy, and accountability, and becoming models of possibility for men. We will go there, but we'll go there together. The surfacing of realities of which people of other genders have faced does not mean solutions are at the expense of men or that men's struggles aren't important, but the repair and healing within our community starts here, owning hurt and harm that we cause, and then we can find better maps to manhood together. I also want to acknowledge the blood, sweat, and tears of women, people across the LGBTQ2 spectrum who have laid a path to have these conversations around gender equality and gender change and gender justice. And the conversations that I try to help inspire are just one piece of that larger vehicle, the work that many of you do who are listening and people across the spectrum who do work around gender equality. We all contribute to that larger vehicle towards change, and all the pieces work together and support each other. So this conversation of engaging men and boys to me is one piece of that vehicle towards a future without violence and a future of equality. And for me, it's talking about how we can be better teammates, working together towards more inclusive spaces, and furthering a collaborative group dynamic where everyone can achieve, can contribute, and nurturing an inspiring environment. And quickly off the bat, I want to just mention what this is and what this isn't. This is a bit of a potluck conversation. I'm bringing the main course, but I think a lot of you are going to bring, if you will, appetizers and complement the main course with a conversation at the end. But I'm going to, as the speaker, share off the top, of course, and valuing the different perspectives and contributions into the mix, absolutely. And it's also important to acknowledge that this isn't a blame or shame conversation. It's a conversation of us, not us versus them. And I think for the men who are listening, people of other genders who've been doing work around these issues, it's about us coming together to create change. You know, and over the last 10 years, I think a lot has surfaced. A lot has surfaced as far as, you know, when we think of the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, the realities of people across the country and across the world. What has also surfaced is our attitudes about that, how we feel about that, our reaction. Do we lean in and want to figure out how we can help and learn and do more? Or do we double back and double down in defensiveness and denial? And I think that, when we think of every statistic is a story, and every story is a person. So what are the stories that we hear? What stories are missing? What are the stories that we need to hear more? And how our gender impacts our story from being heard? Thinking about who and what we value and who and what we devalue, and where we draw the line on certain issues, the lines between us as well. Thich Nhat Hanh once said that we are here to awaken from the illusion of our separateness, and that quote really guides me in the work that I do, that it's about coming together and trying to find ways to bridge the gaps between us. Building bridges between us starts with building bridges within us. I think the internal divides reflect the conflict that we see across our community and across the nation and the world. And I think these conversations can be a part of that healing and that work. So when we talk about building bridges between people of all genders, for me, that's creating a middle ground for men to grow, to learn and unlearn. It's engaging men for the benefit of survivors and for families impacted by violence, and also obviously to the benefit of men and young men and boys as well. And it's meeting men halfway, encouraging them to take a step forward with humility and accountability, to help us understand what's happening in their minds and how they can begin a journey of learning and unlearning. So before the pandemic, I did a lot of talks in person, obviously. And one of the questions I asked people across North America, I actually asked, it was a two-part question that I would ask people. I would ask people, how many of you have been stuck in an elevator before? And I always love pausing to hear all the different responses and stories from people of their being trapped in an elevator. I mean, of course, it worked out well because they were there to tell the story. I had a happy ending. But that was to lead up to what I think was the ultimate question that you could ask yourself. And that question is, am I the kind of person that someone would want to be stuck in an elevator with? So, you might be sitting there thinking, oh, yeah, who wouldn't want to be stuck in an elevator with me? I can be very, I can calm people down. I can lighten the moment. I'm very quick on my feet. I can think of solutions. But what would your colleagues say, or your friends or family, right? And thinking about what your reputation is before you walk in the room, when you leave the room, what are people saying? What are people thinking? And what do you want that to be? And I think that's really thinking about our story and the narrative people have of us and the impact we have. Dr. Brene Brown once said, own the story or the story will own you. Owning our stories can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it. So for me, in this day and age of impressions, and I think we're all sometimes too fixated on the impression we have on others, whether it's on social media or in-person interactions. But rather than the impression that we have on others, I think as men, we can focus more so on the impact we leave with others. How do we leave people feeling about our interaction? How do we leave them feeling about men, about the community, the country, and the world we live in, and taking ownership of that impact and how it could be a good impact? Speaking of elevators, my friend Nikki told me a story about her friend Chris. Chris is a tall guy, covered in tattoos, big guy. He was in an elevator once, in those sketchy parking lots and like in the horror films, right? Like, it's very dark and the lights are flickering. And he's in this kind of rickety elevator and the door slowly creeps open. And outside the elevator waiting to come inside is a woman. And the woman looks up at Chris and says, "Excuse me, do you mind getting off the elevator so I can get on?" Now, I'm not going to judge you for whatever your reaction is. Some people might be thinking, oh, she's got to get it together. Or, hey, it's a free country, get your own elevator. What I'm hoping is that more men, young men and boys in a situation like that, their initial reaction is, what has this woman gone through that she has to ask a complete stranger to get out of a tin box for 10 seconds, right? So in this case, Chris, without missing a beat, said certainly and got out and took the stairs the rest of the way. But I think for me, this is an example of in everyday moments, learning to see the invisible, learning to see one another and what other people are going through. You know, you could be sitting with someone in a boardroom, you know, in a public space, in a meeting, and be having two very different experiences. James Baldwin once said, if I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things that you don't see. Dr. Derald Sue is an anti-racist activist in the States, and he had a line that I love. He said, discomfort is diagnostic. So think of it if you're driving around, and if you're like me, you're driving to a meeting or you're headed somewhere, and all of a sudden a light comes on your dashboard. It could be like an engine light or an oil light, the flux capacitor, something like that. And you just kind of go, oh, okay, didn't see that. You know, just going to keep driving, didn't see it. Or you might be in conversation with someone and you say something, maybe at a party or at a gathering, and you know you said something that was maybe not offensive, like extremely offensive, but you said something that didn't land well, and it feels like a piano falling in your stomach, right? That kind of gut punch. I think what we can do more is not overwhelm ourselves and kind of beating ourselves up around it, but kind of lean into the discomfort of that conversation and take it on as a learning. Creating a learning culture, I think, is so important for us. You know, we're so good at holding up mirrors to society and saying, look at yourselves and look at what you're doing. And I think that's an important piece. What I'm hoping that more and more men do is as they hold up the mirror, they're also looking inside it as well. And they're looking at their own reflection. And they're in real time reflecting how they are looking at their own behavior and their own impact and how they're trying to change that. And how that is as important as calling out other people's behavior, is demonstrating how to do that self-reflexive work. So for me, it's models of possibility, examples of what manhood can look like. I'm thinking of an event that many years that we put on back in the day, and I brought some people of different faith and creed together for a conversation. And one of those individuals was Imam Khalid Latif. You see him on the right there. And he came from New York to talk about, you know, for Muslim folks, like how important these conversations are when it comes to ideas of manhood and men being of character and of quality and respect. And he had a prayer that I wanted to say really quickly here as we get started. May you be protected from hearts that are not humble, tongues that are not wise, and eyes that have forgotten how to cry. And thinking of the construction of gender, and of course it's something that we create together, it's traditions and ideas, rituals that we hand down from generation to generation, from people to people, in cities, in communities, and families, in different places of activity. Something to think about. We might bring it up during the conversation at the end or might not, but something for you to kind of consider as well is, what is Canadian masculinity? What does it mean to be a man here in Canada? And what does that look like for people who are settlers, who are born here, have been here for generations, people who are, you know, Indigenous folks who here on the land, newcomers, people like myself whose family came here and you know, you're the first generation that was here. What does that look like? But of course, regardless of where you are here around the world, unfortunately, ideas of gender can be very limiting, very binary. It's kind of like one door or the other. And it's a long, narrow path as far as who you can be and who you're not supposed to be when it comes to gender. And when we raise someone to be a young boy, what we're doing is, in society collectively, and this is generally, you know, it's slowly giving them ideas of who they're supposed to be, that they need to be tough and strong and have all the answers. You're supposed to be the solution, not the problem. And anything less than that is considered soft, considered weak, considered feminine. So we're creating two ideas. We're creating this impossible, unattainable idea of manhood that young boy is going to spend the rest of his life chasing. And it's created at the expense of devaluing anything that's not supposed to be manly. Like, and we'll talk about this, things that are deemed feminine. So again, these ideas of what it means to be a man become so important. They rule everything that we do as men, as far as our thoughts and actions. And if you're thinking of climbing a ladder of success, to the successful idea of manhood, whether that's personally or professionally, I think that what we're really looking at is, I describe it as the ladder of manhood, climbing this ladder to try to achieve this idea of manhood that impacts all of us. And we're going to talk a bit about that as we move on. And I think it's a ladder that's rigged, that is set to fail, no matter where you are on this ladder. It's a ladder that does not help us, and it harms everyone else. Because if you're raising someone to be a young boy, you might carve out things like empathy, love, and emotional intelligence. And if you're raising someone to be a young girl, again, in this binary idea, limiting idea, things like assertiveness might be pulled away, like a not ladylike or not for them. So we end up having people walking around like half beings, disconnected from a full, holistic, whole idea of who they can be. And I think this is more in particular when it comes to a lot of the men that we love, live with, work with, are related to, interact with in our communities. You know, the richness of who you are as a human being, think of it as like a palette full of different colors, different textures, different hues, all these different ideas of who you can be as a person, different traits and different ideas. And for women and people of other genders, they give themselves a bit more permission to have that full spectrum of who they can be. For men, we limit ourselves around some of these traits, things like, you know, being angry, things like not expressing too much happiness, certain traits that we allow as far as emotional expression. And this hardwiring happens in the family or in the community, and it comes from mainstream sources in our collective society. You know, so if you're raising someone to be a young girl, chances are, you know, someone's given them a baby doll or a cook set or a gardening set. What's beautiful about that is they're learning how to nurture. Now, with the baby doll, you're learning how to take care of someone else before you can even take care of yourself. But you're developing tools that you can use as you get older in your friendships and relationships, and eventually romantic relationships, work relationships, of nurturance, how to nurture relationships. But we kind of cut the cord around allowing men and boys, or allowing boys permission to express that emotional intelligence. It becomes like a muscle that atrophies at a certain age. So we even, to the point that we assign ideas of success and failure to a gender, right? And what I mean by that is certain things like being ambitious, being assertive, are deemed as successful, and they're deemed as masculine. And again, traits like emotional intelligence, thinking with empathy, are devalued and seen as weaknesses or things that will lead to failure. And thankfully, that's changing more and more now, as people are realizing that a holistic approach to leadership, and I don't mean leadership like in just the boardroom sense. I mean leadership in our everyday lives, in the way we interact with people, where we work, live, worship, study, and hang out. These are all important traits to embrace. I love this quote here: Indigenous people are very scientific. It's just that our science includes the heart. And I think a great example of this kind of harmony between human traits is Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand. She's an example of a leader who, as she says, that you can be strong and you can be kind. So I think being assertive, kindness, these are human traits, they're leadership traits, they're traits of value. And so these kind of, if you will, power tools of strength can also be things like sensitivity and openness and tenderness. These are all powerful tools, but we need to reprogram and readjust the way we look at it, because the way society teaches young men and boys is that to be a man is very heteronormative, it's very limiting, it's to be the man, you know, get the girl, get the job, you have to be the hero, emotions are weak, and you need to be fit and strong. So it becomes like a choke chain that holds you back from a full idea of who you can be as a man and as a human being, like this elephant stuck here with the rod. These limiting ideas with gender impact men, and of course, in turn, impact people of other genders in a variety of ways. One of the things I also love to ask in my talks across North America is, what do you like or dislike about identifying as a specific gender? So if it's a group of, you know, like an all boys group, I would ask them, what do you like or dislike about being a boy or a young man? So if there's times where I've given a group and it's identified as all young women or girls, sometimes they'll say things like, well, you know, I don't like that if I want to play professional sports, if I want to play sports, that I might not be able to play at a professional level, or I'm made fun of and called names for doing it. Young boys will say things like, you know, whenever I just want to play, there's always someone that is taking it too seriously and wants to win at all costs and is cheating and, you know, banging elbows or doing things like that and being very harmful. So I remember asking this question to a group of grade 4 boys many, many, many years ago. The question of what do you like or not like about being a boy? I got them into groups and I made them make lists. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to show you this list here. And I'm going to give you a second to take a look at that as I take a quick sip. So you see here, there's a bunch of really wonderful answers here. And starting from the bottom, grow hair everywhere, boys smell bad, having an automatic bad reputation. The one at the top is the one that got my attention, not being able to be a mother. And the young boy who wrote that talked about, you know, commercials for baby dolls and how the commercials for baby dolls, it's always girls that are playing with the dolls and not boys. So I can't be a mother. And I remember looking at him and saying, well, but you could be a dad, like you could be a father. And he looked at me with this screwed up face, like, what are you talking about? You know, so it was something that he had never seen. So maybe his father or a father figure in his life was not physically present, or maybe they were physically present but not emotionally present. And I think about the impact that has on their ideas of who they can be. So one of the questions I ask you is, are the boys or young men in your life, in your community, are they on an ascent or a descent into manhood? And what do we want that to look like? This is a series of shirts that were on sale in Canada many years ago. It's called the Problem Solved series. And you can see here the problem that in this situation is that the woman has a problem. So she's articulating, she's raising her voice, she's speaking. But of course, that's reduced in our society to ranting or venting or bitching, because we devalue women, we devalue their voice. So the real problem in this picture is that he's got a problem. The problem is that he has to listen to her. Problem solved, he puts on his headphones, blocks her out. Another version of this shirt shows the same situation. There's the problem. You can see he has a bit of a sweat bead there. He's stressed out from having to listen to this. Problem solved, he drop kicks her. There's another version of the shirt that shows the woman falling implied to her death. So there are two messages in this shirt. The message for girls and women is to know your role and shut your mouth. Be ladylike. But the message for boys is, bro, if you got a problem, you got to man up and solve it. And the way we solve our problems is through violence. So thinking about this pursuit of identity as men, what it means to be a man, right? And a lot of it is a performance, something that we have to prove and perform. It's a measurement that we have to constantly reassure and provide and demonstrate. So the way you eat, you got to eat like a man. You've got to bake like a man. You've got to even hug like a man, right? The formula for manhood becomes to prove that you're not a woman. And unfortunately, in 2021, that is still the case. What does that again say about the way we value people of other genders? And what does that say about us as men and young men and boys, our ideas of manhood? And when we think about homophobia and transphobia, they're rooted in the violence against women. Because the policing that we do, and I'm talking about men, is that, you know, we'll look at people and say, well, you need to act like a woman, you need to act like a man. And we will police that kind of in and out of other people. So someone that we read as a man will say, well, you need to act like a man, and these are the traits and these things. I don't value women. I don't value traits that are considered feminine. So I will police those out of you verbally or physically to the point of violence, right? And thinking about how these things are tied to what I talk about with the ladder, you know, it's one part of the larger conversation around homophobia and transphobia, but it's one that I think as men we need to really wrap our heads around. Like, what are the root causes? Why is it that homophobia and transphobia is such a raw reaction for a lot of us as men. And again, this performance of manhood leaves us pretending to try to be something we're not as men, you know? And I think of in life, the way we approach life is like it's a game. And in the game of life, you need to be the man. You need to be the hero in your own life. You need to be the conqueror, the winner, winning at all costs. So again, in the game of life, we approach life where you need to be the man. So what that does is all these things I've talked about leave men walking around. It's almost like our identity, our value of ourselves is like a house of cards they have to constantly protect. And if you've ever built a house of cards, you know how delicate the table is, any gust of wind, anything like that. And that is a lot of when it comes to, for men and young men, the construction of our identity can be just as fragile and as delicate, and we are just as defensive around that fragile idea. So that leaves us with our idea of physical being and how we think we need to project or look a certain way to demonstrate strength. So when it comes to, for example, going to see a doctor, men will not go because we sometimes feel that, you know, this is weakness to go admit that you need help. You know, you'll walk it off and shake it off, you know, instead of reaching out and asking for help. And it's not just physical health, it's also emotional health. Like if you have a physical wound, you need to get that looked at. If you have an emotional wound, you need to also get that looked at. And how we don't reach out for help or ask for help because we are afraid of being perceived as weak or vulnerable. So when we hear conversations around self-care, we think of it as something feminine and we devalue it. And again, not all men, but a number of men. Self-care is so important. Self-care is community care. It's to the benefit of us, but also those of us that we love around us. Thinking of during the pandemic, a lot of people isolating, thinking of how self-care is, and we'll talk about this a bit later, how essential self-care is when we think of taking care of our emotional well-being and how we impact those we're isolating with, partners, our husbands or wives, children, people that we love, roommates, etc. And so self-care needs to be thought of like you're working on your car. You're getting in there, you're getting oil on your fingers, you're getting dirty. It's that kind of hard work that we need to do as men. We'll talk a bit about that later, because that leaves a lot of us as men struggling and feeling like we're drowning in our emotion, that we're hiding from everybody. Because of course you have to demonstrate that you're in a place of power. You need to demonstrate that you're holding power. I think this is an essential piece to this conversation. Our entire self-value and identity as men feels for us like it's tied to where we are on that ladder. And we can say this is true of people of all genders, but I think people of other genders who are not men, cis hetero guys in particular, I think you learn to develop a sense of your identity through struggle and conflict, and your value isn't tied to always winning all the time. You learn, because of nurturance and emotional intelligence, how to navigate defeat, how to navigate struggle, and not winning all the time or dominating all the time. And this is this kind of ascension to true power. This is the perspective for men. And where are we on that ladder as men? If you're a man of color, person with a disability, if you're an indigenous man, and this doesn't even speak of, for example, a Black woman who's trans, or women, people of the LGBTQ spectrum, etc. Where are they on this kind of hierarchy in society? Having an advantage, of course, is not about fault or merit. It can be about what you do with that advantage. That's what can define you. Of course, for a lot of us, though, unfortunately, power means power over, and it's power at the expense of others, or that's the perception that we as men have, whether we're conscious of it or not. Men are coded with the governing belief that our sole value is in holding power, so our lives become this conflicted struggle in order to achieve it. And so a lot of us as men are lost in the proverbial woods, trying to figure out our identity, who we are, our value, what's our worth, and feeling a sense of belonging. And if we don't have that, unfortunately, we will look for belonging, whether it's, gangs or online spaces. And now more than ever, it's dangerous for young men and boys navigating online spaces, and a lot of the, alt-right or very extremist spaces and elements that are online where they can feel belonging, but what the connection is they feel belonging over their collective hatred of women or people who are different and other than, and I think those are conversations that we definitely need to have. So in this pursuit of perceived excellence, our ideas of success, what we consider successful in our lives as men, what it looks like to be a successful man, that plays out, for example, in the workplace. And we don't have a lot of time to unpack this, but if you want to look it up, Harvard Business Review, there's a great piece on how masculinity contests undermine organizations and what to do about it. And they surveyed thousands of people across the US and Canada from different organizations talking about these masculine qualities that were prized and these kind of hierarchies created in the workplace. And they highlighted 4 masculine norms that they feel define masculinity contest culture. And I apologize, I'm rushing through this. I know this is being recorded, so you could probably go back and read this later on or look up that article. But here, for one example, is showing no weakness, right? Or it's strength and stamina, like those who are able to kind of work extreme hours and show how dedicated they are to their work. People that, put work first is kind of like not taking a break, not prioritizing family, etc. Or it's this kind of like dog eat dog culture where it's about winners and losers, and all these things create very harmful, toxic work environments and work culture. Because again, it's all about winning, and it's the fear of losing because of our fragile identity and self-value. So this comes up a lot, and we use it a lot to kind of poke fun, but it's really at the core of a lot of this, the fragility for men around these conversations, because it's about dominating, always feeling that you need to be in control, you need to be the certainty. And especially in this era, this time we've had through the pandemic of uncertainty, that's left a lot of men spiraling because they feel like they need to be able to solve the problem and be the solution to problems. Because it's either you're the superhero or you're a zero. There's no in between. Like you're either the winner or you're a loser. So what then ends up doing is that we, for example, for cis hetero men, we reduce the women in our lives as trophies, things that we acquire to demonstrate status to one another. So when you see a group of, 4 young boys, for example, standing along on the street and a woman walks by and they start catcalling her or maybe physically trying to grab her body, they're not doing it thinking this is a great way to meet a future partner. They're doing it to elevate themselves and their social status amongst the boys, right, at her expense. Or it might be a guy doing it who's by himself, catcalling or harassing a woman on the street, doing that to, again, create a sense of power over to, address whatever's coming up for them as far as inadequacy or a kind of failed masculinity, which we'll talk about later on. So on the ladder of manhood, we reduce women and girls to the rungs on the ladder. They become the rungs on the ladder that we use as stepping stones. And again, for a lot of young men that leaves us feeling we've failed as men if we're not able to achieve these ideas of manhood. And that's where you get into the misogynistic incel culture. A lot of young men who feel disenfranchised and disillusioned, and they've failed at this dominance culture and this idea of sexual conquest, that their identity is tied to so-called success in all aspects of life, whether it's sexual and romantic or in different fields, careers, things that they're doing. So many men will feel okay with being vulnerable when there's no sense of danger or threat. So what's perceived as a threat is vulnerability itself. This is the irony, right? Or when they see others being empowered, they feel that it's empowerment at their expense. So a lot of young men will turn on each other as well in climbing up the ladder to try to seek status and seek identity. And when we're talking about the different intersections, there's not enough time. We could spend you could spend a whole month talking about these different issues. But when it comes to race and power and masculinity, that's an important part of the conversation as well. This is the cover of Vogue magazine from 2009. It's a pretty old picture, but over these years, I've still kept using it because it's a very powerful image. When this cover came out, it caused a huge uproar because it invoked a classic Hollywood image and a classic racial stereotype of Black men as savages or sexual savages, right? So instead of a bone, LeBron James has the basketball, he has the white woman in his hand, and all these stereotypes of black men as rapists and all these different things. Because we talk about the valuing of men and this ladder of manhood, for men of color, we think of black men here in Canada and of course in the States. It's first of all identifying that I am a man, I'm a human being, I am of value, right? And again, this doesn't even speak to where we in society value black women, black trans women, right? But when we think of men, this is the challenge for men. So men of color have to double down and feel like they have to work twice as hard because they are further down in the ladder. So they have to be twice as smart, twice as strong, twice they double down on this harmful idea of manhood. So they'll double down on these harmful behaviors to try to climb up the ladder, to be at an equal pairing with everyone else, everyone just excelling and being better than everyone. But of course, important part of the conversation, and I hate to kind of skim through all these things, and the idea for me is to give you a lot of things to hopefully deep dive into in your own ways and keep these conversations going. I think of white men and white young men who are promised this kind of idea of access to the top of the ladder, this idea of entitlement. And what you're seeing is they experience, and again, I apologize, but for lack of a better phrase, their own kind of ceiling when it comes to being white men achieving status and power and all power. They realize that there's a bit of a ceiling for them. And an example of what I'm talking about, for those of you who've seen the film The Social Network, it is a great example of what I'm talking about when it comes to entitlement for white men and hitting this kind of ceiling, if you will, in their journey. Mark Zuckerberg, of course, is a student at Harvard, and he feels that he's in a place where he can achieve and do all the things he wants to do. And he comes across I think it's the Winklevoss twins. And these are an example of two young white men who they're athletic, they're on the rowing team, they come from status, they come from money, and they are of an uber elite. And Zuckerberg realizes that he doesn't, even though he's at Harvard, which is a place of privilege, he isn't allowed to go to that next level. There's a ceiling for him. So there's a bit of a resentment that he develops, and that translates into him taking vengeance. And of course, he is in the film, and it's, the films are, of course, a play on reality, so they kind of bend reality. But essentially, in the film, at least, the story is that anger out of not being part of the elite, of his girlfriend breaking up with him, he creates a kind of hot or not application called Face Mash. And they steal all the ID images of women on campus, and all of a sudden men are encouraged to vote which of these two women would they sleep with, or who's hotter, and this application, this software game, blows up, eventually shuts down the Harvard internet. And of course, this is at the expense of women, this kind of game and these kind of charades. And, Zuckerberg, of course, goes on to, from this, I'm not saying it was a direct jump, but he goes on to create what we now know as Facebook. And Facebook had on its walls infamously this slogan of move fast and break things, right? So damn the consequences, let's just move forward and do things. And of course, now they're trying to be held accountable for the harm they've caused. Because I think for a lot of us as men, wait for it. There it is. It's the allergic to accountability for us as men, allergic of having to be held accountable for the causes and the impact that we have. So when it comes to engaging white men around these conversations in particular, and this is true of men in general, a lot of this, there's a lot of pushback that we get from white men to the conversation. The perception that the conversation itself, they're being persecuted by just the fact that we're having this conversation. And of course, that betrays their legitimate challenges that if they really do want to address them, they could address them, but they're more fixated on women, or blaming feminism, or blaming the LGBTQ community, or blaming people of other religions or racial backgrounds. And invitations into accountability, or if that doesn't work, ultimately being held accountable, is also perceived as a threat for them. So the feeling that we feel is that sometimes we need to completely coddle them so they'll hear these conversations. So it's the tricky thing about creating a middle ground is you want to invite them into the discomfort of the conversation. But of course, no one wants to be uncomfortable, right? We don't want to face tension and hardships and face ourselves. So this is the challenge. But I think for some of us, not for all of us, there are people who are like, that's not my work. I'm sick of having to do this work with men in their personal lives or even professional lives. And I respect that. But I think some of us need to kind of think about how we can play a role in trying to invite these men into accountability or to invite them in on a journey of change. Because if we know that self-identity informs emotional intelligence, some of us need to be invested in the work with men and white men in their developing healthy and positive self-identities, not an identity at the expense of others or devaluing others. Because if you feel less powerful or have less access to power, thinking again of for communities of color and for men, what we need to do to try to climb that ladder. And of course, the spectrum of what it means to be a man of color is very diverse because it's not just cis hetero guys. Of course, it's trans men. It's a variety of ideas of who you can be as a man. And you think of the payoffs and the costs, in particular of marginalized men who double down and play into these harmful ideas of manhood. And if you have less access to privilege and power, how do you solve powerlessness? You turn up the volume on your presentation of manhood. Maybe it's hyper masculinity. And the quickest way to climb up that ladder that I talked about is through violence, unfortunately, right? So these displays of violence, which can be minimal, but they go along the spectrum of disappointing, hurtful, and harmful behavior. So many young men and men are fluent in the language of violence. And it's not just the extremes of physical sexual violence. It is everyday violence in our language and the things that we do. And thinking of the horrific act of violence in Christchurch, New Zealand, where a man shot up a mosque, thinking of the horrific loss of life for that Muslim family, 3 generations in London wiped out by a young man. We don't know about his story. And it's not about putting him on a platform or glorifying him, which is what the goal of a lot of these terrorists and serial killers have. But it's understanding what are the things that go into a young man or a man breaking down like this into an act of violence and their fluency in violence. And a lot of what I talked about is part of that conversation, along with Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hate and racism. The conversation of why men, white young men in particular, go down this path of fatal violence is an important part of the conversation. Of course, it's not just physical violence. It's also verbal violence as well. Our words can break people down. They can lift people up. They can build and destroy. Archbishop Desmond Tutu once said, language is very powerful. Language does not just describe reality. Language creates the reality it describes. So we think about the words we use and the power behind our words, and the idea of microaggressions as well, the everyday slights and indignities, put downs and insults that people of color, women, LGBTQ populations, or those who are marginalized experience in their day-to-day interactions. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm just going to quickly go through the remainder of my presentation so we can get to some conversations. So I apologize if I'm going a little fast here. But thinking about our learnings from the pandemic and some takeaways, I think for men, having to become mindful of who's around us, our physical space, our 6-foot radius around us, gives us insight into the everyday realities of women, LGBTQ people, and their idea of physical safety, who is around them. You know, like my friend Laura described it as access before intimacy, meaning in previous times, men would feel just entitled to women's bodies. Like if they're passing them in a crowded space, they put the hand on the small of their back and push them out of the way. If it's a guy, they would just put their hand on the shoulder, you know, things like this. Thinking about, you know, who's standing so close behind me in the grocery line. These are moments where men started to tune into and had an opportunity for aha moments. And of course, it's not just in person, offline interactions, it's also online interactions where women have had to almost put on what I describe as emotional PPE to protect themselves from, you know, harmful behavior and attitudes that they can just walking down the street, just going on a dating app, what they are exposed to in everyday life. So I wrote a piece about this on Higher Learning called Emotional PPE and Other Takeaways for Guys in a Pandemic, if you want to check that out and read that and share that with the men in your life. Because I talk a bit about some of this stuff, talking about, navigating consent in everyday interactions, not just romantic or sexual, but seeking consent in everything that we do. For men, the reality is that, what we do is that we layer up emotionally to protect ourselves from vulnerability, because vulnerability is the virus that we fear as men. And you think about the resistance from men, from when some men in wearing masks, feeling that it's not manly, etc. It's a display of weakness. Some men will not wear a mask because the infection we carry as men is the belief that being perceived as weak is worse than death itself. These are the symptoms of our infected ideas of manhood, which we super spread from generation to generation as men. Some of us have had increased exposure to it, and it shows up in our everyday interactions. So it's these wounds that create other wounds. I apologize. I'm going to skip through a couple of slides here just to get us back on track. Another piece that I wrote on Higher Learning looks at thoughts from men on coping with social distancing and isolation. And I talk a bit about, how we're trying to avoid the virus, but not our feels. So rather than fight, flight, or freeze, I think what we can do as men is the other F, which is face some of the emotional challenges that we're dealing with and trying to navigate. And I talk a bit about that in the article, and you can check that out online as well. But all these cycles of, harmful traditions and ideas of manhood, it's that we can break the cycles of violence and the things that we hand down. Because if you're successful in this narrow idea of being a man, you're failing as a human being. So what can we do to change that? How can we change that in our everyday lives? I don't need to be the man in order to be a man. So what do we do? What do we do around these conversations? For me, it's rather than measure a man by what he can demonstrate, own, or produce, we can measure a man by how he serves, how he gives, and how he lives. The problem is that we treat manhood like a destination when it's a journey. It's a lifelong journey of unlearning and learning. So it's about having paths forward, ways forward along this journey for men and young men and boys in our lives, for ourselves as men who are trying to model that change. The thing is, the filtered lens that we're talking about, these ideas of manhood, how they impact the way we view the world. So it impacts the way we interpret things. Like when you say something, how that lands for me as a man. So when we hear things like, you got to be better, you got to do better, you're not good enough, you're not manly, we interpret that through this idea of you're challenging my manhood. I'm not manly enough. I'm not better than this other guy, or I'm not good enough. But what we're saying, it's not about being better than other men. Doing better means being better than our yesterdays. And I think that's the critical piece for men to understand and embrace. That it's not about this hierarchy, domination culture. It's getting off that ladder and realizing it's about a journey. And it's about improving every day in our journey, measuring ourselves. And I think mindful manhood is the goal when it comes to that. So for me, models of possibility, examples of what that can look like for men. I apologize. I'm going to skip through a couple of slides here to get us on track. I want to quickly show you this picture, though, because there are conversations of what we should do as men. But to me, this is a conversation of what we must do as men, as far as thinking about how we can be allies for change, how we can impact women and girls. I'm going to show you a photograph here, and I want you to think about who you are in this picture and who the men and young men and boys in your life or in your community would be in this picture. So this is a photo taken many years ago. It's a photo taken from the Boston Marathon. So, I believe it's over 50 years ago. And Catherine Switzer is the runner in the center. She was trying to run in the marathon because women weren't allowed to run in the marathon at that time. She registered the mail, got her initials, and showed up the day of the race wearing a hoodie to cover her face, and took off the hoodie, put her numbers on. The guy in the back there behind her in the black jacket is Jock Semple. He was an organizer for the marathon at the time. And he tried to catch up to her and hit her and get her out of the race and physically remove her from the race. And in that moment, the screen captures a moment where I asked the men and boys that I talked to, who are you going to be in this picture? And who do you want the men and boys in your life to be in this picture? to me, there's a number of choices. Catherine's empowering herself. It's her race to run. But you see the guy in the shorts right next to her on her right, your left, the white shorts, he's trying to get involved. He's trying to step up and step back. It's her race to run, but with his body language, maybe with his voice, he's trying to break up the violence and try to stop what's happening. But I think the most important role is any of these guys that are gathered around like a half circle around the scenario, they can get involved and shift what's going to happen. Because if they support Jock with their body language, maybe saying, what's she doing here? Get her out of here. Everyone else will kind of back off and say, okay, I'm just going to focus on the race. But if they support the guy in the shorts, and most importantly, support Catherine with their body language, maybe with their voice, saying, hey, stop hitting her. That's not cool. Leave her alone. That shifts and shapes the outcome of the situation. And of course, the third choice, if you look right at the bottom, there's a guy there at the bottom with the big smiley face. He's like, it's not my problem. Good luck with that. I got a race to run. And we choose one of these roles in everyday life. We either get involved or we say it's not my problem. And we need to recognize that it's something we need to get involved with. Roy Rana is a basketball coach who says good teams have good players, but great teams have great teammates. So it's about being a better teammate and building community and connection where you work, live, study, worship, and play. Now, we talk about this all like it's so easy, right? That allyship and doing the right thing is a very simple straight line when it's not. So it's overcoming the perceived costs and real costs of trying to be an ally for change. A long story short, if you've never heard of the Clothesline Project, it's a project that happens around the world. And what you do is you take a bunch of blank shirts and perhaps you go to a women's shelter or you get a group of survivors to share stories, slogans, statements about themselves and what they've been through. And you would take these shirts and hang up these statements and slogans, solidarity statements on these shirts. You'd hang them up on clotheslines in your campus or in your community. And you'd have other shirts there so that people could also write on shirts and contribute their statements and support or their own stories as well. So I was staffing one of these tables on a campus years ago when I first started getting to this work in 2008. And a group of 4 guys walked by the table and they saw me standing there. They saw the shirts. So they asked me what's going on. They just come back from the gym and they're all, hanging out together. And as I was explaining to them a little bit more, elaborately than I just did for you all, they all kind of checked out. You could see their language is like, oh, this is like a woman thing, and they weren't paying attention. But there was one young man in the middle of the 4 who was looking at the shirts, looking at me. But then when he realized that his friends weren't interested, his body language changed. His shoulders shrunk. He kind of stepped back, and he realized, oh, I'm not getting permission from my group to be interested or engaged in this conversation. Just in that moment, they recognized the guy that they knew. So they all turned around and they're all like, oh, what's going on, man? And while they were distracted, this young man came back to me and was like, tell me more about these shirts. So I think about how we create permissions amongst communities and spaces, amongst our collectives and groups, how we can create permission as men to have these conversations and say that it's okay. Some of the roadblocks that we have are fear and shame. When it comes to shame over the things we did, fear over how people will be perceived in having these conversations. I think learning from our mistakes is a big part of this conversation as well. Rather than saying those men or these men, I think we need to say we as men, implicate ourselves and say we as men need to do better. Rather than saying that most men are good men, I think it's saying, we as men need to do better, because there's a spectrum of hurt and harm that we cause. And I apologize, I'm going to skip through a bunch of slides here. But it's about striving to be an ally in action. It's not just a verb, it's a verb, right? I love this quote from the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center. Being an ally is an active way of seeing and being in the world in order to transform it. So thinking about the ways we have an impact and how we can have a good impact in communities. So for men, it's about getting to work and doing this hard work, being accountable, owning responsibility, building community. And as men, we can determine who we are, we can be what we believe, and we can show up for the consequences of that, and we can do better than our yesterdays. So it's again thinking about the tools we have in the toolbox for that work, because I think we can talk a lot about rules of things we shouldn't do or cannot do, but we need to talk about tools. the things that we need to do. This is a line from a group called COPA, which is a English group based on a Francophone group out of Quebec, and the version here in Ontario speaks to people who are English and French speaking, but they do a lot of work with children around equity and human rights issues. And they have that phrase, tools and rules, which I love. So thinking about the tools that we need to nurture these conversations like a garden. And I apologize, I'm going to skip through a couple of slides here. But I think it's important to think about, you got to get, if you're a gardener, you got to get dirty. To do this work of learning and unlearning, you need to get in the garden on your hands and knees and get dirty, right? And the other thing is planting those seeds of change. You can toss seeds into dry soil, but they're not going to take root. So that we need to nurture the soil. And if the community is the soil, if the minds of young men and boys and men are the soil, we need to nurture that soil so they're ready for these conversations. Now, what's beautiful is the kindergarten lesson that we all forgot from back in the day. If you ever did this exercise where you're given a plastic cup and a bean and paper towel and a piece of masking tape, you'd write your name on the tape and you put it on the cup, and all 30 of you in kindergarten or 20 of you would have your cups, and you put them on the windowsill, and every day you'd put them, add a little bit of water to them, and you'd watch them grow. What you learn from this is that you don't need to have the most expensive or perfect soil, but you need to nurture the soil, nurture the environment. In this case, instead of soil, it was a paper towel and a cup and some water and sunlight. So that nurturance, allowing it to grow. I think for men to nurture these conversations in our own lives and nurture the communities that we're in is how change happens. So it's about doing the work. This conversation is not unique to your space, but there's a unique conversation to be had in your space. Okay, I'm going to power through here, so I apologize. As men, we can be helpers instead of fixers. I think it's an important part of the conversation. In striving to be an ally, we can reject the need to be the fixer and try to fix everything, and that our worth is in solving the problem and fixing things. We can approach allyship as a helper. How can I help? How can I serve? How can I give? We can go from I got this to I got you. And I think that's a big part of the shift that as men in learning and reality, valuing and hearing the stories and the realities of women and girls, people across the spectrum, the LGBTQ2S spectrum. And it's developing emotional literacy is a big part of this conversation. Recognizing that, if I'm feeling anger, under the surface, there's a whole storm of feelings, there's a wheel of emotions. So learning how to describe that. And I think it's the heavy lifting that we need to do as men. We leave a lot of this heavy lifting to the women in our lives, people of other genders, this emotional labor. I think as men, we can do that heavy lifting together, having these conversations, doing this work. They say that compassion without action is just observation. So I think we need to learn to build our empathy muscles, because empathy is the bridge from awareness and compassion going into empathy. That's the bridge into taking action. And the steps towards empathy are so important. But I think that is the big critical piece that's missing for us as men, to be able to empathize and understand. The phrase I use is, I see you, I feel you, I got you. I see you as I see the statistics. I see the reality of what, for women, for example, of what women are going through. But I feel you, is the empathy piece. I recognize how that would impact you. Why you would leave the field that you're in, you'd be pushed out of your career, how that impacts your feeling of being unsafe just going into work, walking down the street, how that impacts your feeling of belonging. So that's the empathy piece. I got you is the action piece. How can I take action? How can I support? So going from head, heart to action. I see you, I feel you, I got you. And of course, as men, we can spot each other emotionally in this emotional gym of developing this empathy, of doing the hard inner work we need to do around self-care, around therapy, and these kinds of conversations. So learning how to ask for help and offering help is very important. And I think about how men, when it comes to career goals, success goals, physical health goals, like getting in shape, we'll stare at a picture of like a Schwarzenegger and we'll dedicate to working our ass off to build that muscle. But why aren't men as determined to work just as hard to build our emotional muscle, right? To do the emotional work. So we want to get this men to the place where we want to get after it and do the hard work emotionally, as well as we do in other aspects and other goals in our life, to value these goals of being, again, doing better as a man. So it's building emotional muscle memory. I think it's the repetition of doing this work to build the muscle memory. And that's practice, practice, practice when it comes to developing empathy, to working those muscles. So again, we should raise boys and young men to be fluent in the language of consent. So we navigate life seeking consent in every interaction we have. So when it comes time to explore romantic and sexual interactions, they will instinctively seek mutual consent. And again, this is not just about romantic sexual interactions, it's about consent in everything that we do and how we do it. So again, empathy is that atrophied muscle, one of the emotional muscles that we can work together and build. You don't have to make working towards change. You don't have to make working towards change your life's work, but you can work towards change throughout your life. You know, I don't think that what I do is very special. I think what's powerful is when people take action around the water cooler, at the house party, you know, at the hockey game, whatever it is. Those are the moments when they show up. That's where real change happens. You plant seeds. You show an example of how to do things differently, that you're not like everyone else, and then you model a possibility of what can be different. So let's get in there and let's do that work. Your beliefs don't make you a better person. Your behavior does. Be mindful of the impact that you can have. Embrace the impact that you can have, and say, this is the kind of impact that I want to have in everyday life. And again, I see you, I feel you, I got you. Going from head, heart, and action, compassion, empathy, into action. And begin that journey, continue that journey throughout life and everything that you do. They say the size of your heart is the size of your fist. So to open your heart is to open the fist. So open up and let go. You know, whether it's getting help, getting support, having these conversations, continuing these conversations, encouraging the men and young men in our lives, you know, that we can live our lives as an invitation. We can be models of possibility. Not to be better than everyone else, but to be better than our yesterdays. And again, it's about being the lesson in action. Not just saying it, being about it and doing it. And keep that conversation going in all aspects of your life, and to encourage young men and boys to be part of these conversations as well. And I want to leave it there so we have time for conversation. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you listening to me quickly go through all that. But thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for that, Jeff. I know I speak on behalf of everybody right now when I say that your words were very inspiring and moving tonight. So I really appreciate you sharing. I just want to tell one quick story, maybe as you glance through some of the comments, and then I think there's a couple questions that we can look at. But you were talking about sort of, you know, how to navigate these conversations with young men, and what impact it might have in their lives. And we were hosting a session for high school boys a couple of years ago, one of our high schools. And as part of the session, the boys were working with a local poet to describe what positive masculinity means to them. And we had this one boy stand up, instantly start crying. And I'll just, you know, tell you a couple lines of his poem, but it's sort of stuck with me ever since. And he says in his poem, I'm about to become a father, but I've yet to learn how to be a man.
Wow.
And it was just in that moment that I think he sort of, you know, demonstrated everything that you're talking about right here, that we need to model, and we need to sort of make sure that we're having these conversations with the men and boys in our lives. I think if we look at the questions, the first question that I wanted to call on first is Shannon. I think you posted a question related to how to get more men and boys engaged in this conversation. Did you want to turn your mic on and elaborate on that, or are you happy with Jeff speaking to what you've written?
Hi, I'm unmuting now. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Okay, perfect. No, I don't really think I wanted to elaborate. I live in a house of boys, 3 teenagers and a husband, 19, 17, and 15. And although I have shared lots of opportunities for them to understand the effects of media and how we're raised and all of that. I really wish there were more men listening even tonight to this presentation. And so my question really is just like, how can I get more men in my life on board here?
Yeah, I mean, this is the $1,000,000 question, right? Because I think, again, so many times the conversation is left to, in this case, for example, for yourself, that you feel that you're left to be trying to push this boulder up the mountain of like, how do I get them engaged? And I think this is the call for me, is that we as men need to answer this call. And whether it's your partner or other men in their lives, I think that they need to answer the call and try to step up and support you in that inspiration and inspiring that they can do better. I think, I absolutely 1000% believe that women can raise, a son to be a man, a boy to be a man, but I think it's encouraging that this is acceptable. It's okay. And I'm sure that you do that with them. So I think it's ongoing work of creating permission, and you might not see it in your, right in front of you, but I think the seeds that you plant will stick and grow, and that someday they will, appreciate and start to bloom and develop that kind of holistic idea of who they can be, and appreciate that you were there telling them that, it can be more than this, and that there are so many different ways. Matthew, I don't know if you wanted to add to that as well, but it breaks my heart because I think there's so many people who are just, wanting the men in their lives to show up for this conversation. And if it's sharing this recording or some of the work that other men are doing, examples of whether, for example, the actor Justin Baldoni has a book out now called Man Enough, and he also has a podcast coming out. That's one of many different examples, hopefully, that are inspiring to men and boys. But Matthew, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, but
I think the part that resonates with me the most is your story about the one young man that wanted to engage in conversation with you around the t-shirt, right? And I think what we do know is, or what I see in my work, is just how many good men and good boys there are that are out there. But toxic masculinity and patriarchy affects men and boys also, and there's this fear, right, that is weaponized sometimes against men and boys. And so I do think it's opportunities like this to have the courageous conversations to allow those men to have a voice. And I think also it means making sure that the conversations start early, as early as possible, and that we're modeling and being very intentional. So absolutely.
And again, I think it's just a matter of like how we want to climb ladders of success, and these ideas of physical strength or achieving career goals, like this kind of like rise and grind mindset, whatever it is. Like, I think it's encouraging young men and boys and men to also have that kind of mentality when it comes to their emotional well-being. That's also just as manly, and it's not to say Shannon, you or that I'm not giving or telling women what to do, obviously, right? Like people of other genders, it's not me saying do this, do that. I think it's continue to do what you're doing, but it's also recognizing that, how we can encourage them is so much of, it's the reality is that it's to their benefit as well. It's not just doing this for the sake of others, but it should be enough to say, hey, like you need to be better, do better, we can do better because of how we impact others. But it is also a conversation about them. This is to the benefit of them, but it should be enough. But yeah, it's finding a way in that seed plants and sticks. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it looks like we have another question from Carla. And the question was, what does success look like in a non-patriarchal or capitalistic culture?
That's a great question. I think
it's a big one.
I think for me, that success is that you are, someone that when someone wants to approach you, and meet you halfway and say, hey, like, Jeff, like, in your talk, it was really great, but you said something that I didn't agree with or I found offensive. That rather that I meet you with like hostility or defensiveness, that with humility and accountability, I say, let me hear more. Tell me, I'm really sorry. How can I do better? So I think it's in everyday moments being mindful. In everyday moments, it's not about, it's not that you're not, hearing things like that hurts, but what I value more is the impact I've had on someone and how I can do better. And I think that getting rid of this competition dominance culture and valuing my strength and how I serve, again, like for me, the measure of a man is how I serve, how I give, and how I live. So I think these are the things that are, the kind of world we want to aspire towards.
Carla, did that help answer your question?
Yes. Many thanks. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So it looks like we have a very long sort of set of questions. I think it's from Debbie J. I hope I'm saying that properly. But did you want to turn your mic on and maybe just elaborate a piece of it? Because, I think Jeff would have to do a whole nother presentation if you were able to tackle all of that. And so just wondering if you wanted to turn your mic on and maybe speak to a part of your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So I think we really need to think critically about how we're approaching violence. And I think we need to look at prevention along a continuum. I think this is really important because we tend to look at violence as something that's happening now that we need to address, which is okay, but then we fail to look at the roots. What is causing it to happen in the first place? And I think when we start to look at it from that perspective, we start to see our role in it. It's not just about those little boys did not raise themselves. We need to think about how we are contributing to what's happening. When we look at it that way, we will start taking more responsibility for what's happening to those boys as they grow into, when they go to daycare, when they go to school, as they grow, they go to high school, university, out in society. What are those messages that are being put out there as to what these boys are supposed to learn? And that's why I like so much what Jeff said about the learning and unlearning. But we have to take responsibility. We've got to pull back the lens. We have to go way, way back and look at the roots. That's what I'd like to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's what does it mean to be a man in your community, and what are the traditions, the rituals that we hand down from generation to generation, or in a workplace, or in a school environment, or in the community, where our kids hang out, where they worship, where they play. What are the traditions that are handed down? What do we want them to be? And it's owning that we all collectively create and construct these ideas. So how can we dismantle them? And as I say, offer maps to manhood, models of possibility. Because it's one thing to say, don't do this, but so what should we do? Like when we say no means no, well, what does yes look like? Like we need examples of what that looks like, to do better. So that's on us, to do that work. And I talk about us, meaning in particular, obviously men and young men need to model that. But we can collectively do that work together.
I want to jump in too. So not only am I the executive director for the coalition, but I'm also the co-chair for the London Coordinating Committee to End Women Abuse. And on that committee, there's 30 agencies that sit around the city that do work around ending men's violence against women. And I totally agree with you. So we just turned 40, the coordinating committee turned 40 last year. And we still lose about 30 women a year to domestic violence. So we're failing. The numbers increase every year. And I think it's because we're not engaging men in a meaningful way. And we are engaging women after the fact, after the violence happens. And we don't talk to men about the violence in a way that engages them. And that talks exactly what you said to them before we consider them perpetrators, in a way that can stop it from happening again in a way that can stop a path from continuing. And so as the co-chair of that committee, I'm really committed to doing that work, and it needs to change. We need to talk to men in a way that they can hear us and stop, sort of this blame. And so I really loved hearing from you tonight, Jeff, but some of the work also has to be done from, the feminists around the table that have been doing this work for 40 years. We need to change the way we're doing it, because if we want to stop seeing women die, we have to change the conversation, because what we're doing isn't working. We're still seeing women die. So we really have to have another conversation. And systematically, in London, when a man has a charge on him around domestic abuse, we can't get him into a program to help him change, which is shameful and systemically wrong. And so, how do we expect him, to keep a job, to do all the things that, we want him to do to change, when we've created a system that won't allow him to do that, that actually won't allow him. He can't get a job. He can't see his kids. He can't talk to his family. He can't get counseling. He can't do any of the things that he needs to do for what we would say is, man up and do what you need to do. We've created a system that doesn't allow him to do it. So I love your question. And I think there is lots of work to do, not just, from the men, but, from the systems we have created and sort of including the feminist movement. So thank you for the
And then the last question that came in, Claire, did you want to speak to talking to your grandson at all, or did you want Jeff to touch on that?
Hi. Yeah, I can just comment. I've seen Jeff present a few times, and I've always loved this part of his presentation. And I just thought, well, my grandson's 8 years old, so I think it's time for he and I to have that discussion, and I can't wait to do that. And I look forward to sharing it with you, Jeff. And yeah, my question was, what fantastic initiatives are you currently working on, and how can we support you?
Oh, I really, Claire, it's always great, a great friend of mine, and it's great to hear from you and another person in the community doing amazing work. And yeah, looking forward to seeing what your grandson's answers to, what it means to be a man, and what you like or don't like about being a boy. And as far as things that I'm working on, always trying to work on written projects. And I was creating a lot of videos, and I stopped for a while. I had a bit of a dental drama issue for a few months, so I'm able to kind of speak properly now, and hopefully going to be making more videos. But if you go to higherlearning.com, you'll be able to see podcasts and videos and written pieces that I've done and that I continue to put out. But of course, it's also supporting and encouraging men to support organizations like those who are part of the coalition, doing work towards ending violence against women. And that means women's shelters, women's organizations, supporting them as well. As far as, the work that I'm doing, for me, I think of it as kind of bringing men to the table so that they will value and hear the voices of women, people of the LGBTQ spectrum, hear what they're saying, and continue to support them in the work they're doing. But if people want to share the pieces that I've written and videos and things like that, by all means, because again, it's a conversation of us. So thank you so much again for the opportunity to share some words tonight, and thankful for the work that you all do to create a culture of caring and change.
Thank you for that, Jeff. So at this point, I think I am going to turn it back over to Linda for some final words.
Thanks, Matt. I'm actually going to turn it to Danny for just a moment, and then I'll take it back.
I just want to thank the Canadian Federation of University Women and OPSU for the sponsorship. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to make it happen. So just a huge thank you to Lorraine Esquivel and OPSU and the Canadian Federation of University Women.
Great. Thanks, Danny. Just a couple of things. I want to thank the audience, of course, for joining us tonight. As always, we do have these meetings once a month. And And I'm just going to share my screen again. I've got just a couple of more slides that I want to show you. So our next speaking event is next month, and we are going to be talking about pride and gender equality. And so we'll have our moderator will be Alex Pershai, who is our board member, and we'll have on the panel Terrence Kernahan, Anise Trudeau, and Chris Wolf. So please plan to join us. Everyone on the call will get the email as long as you haven't, as long as it isn't blocked or whatever, you will get an email inviting you to join that event next month. The other thing I'd like to tell you about is we mentioned here that we were founded by the Canadian Federation of University Women. And that group will be starting meetings again in September. Our September meeting will be the gathering, we're calling it, and it will be groups, all London groups, London and area organizations coming together to talk about what they're doing coming forward, what some projects they're working on. So it'll be information sharing. So we invite you to join us on September the 1st for that event. And there are no charges for these events. And one other event that we're promoting now is our September 30th. We're going to have a virtual conference. And so we will be partnering with Fanshawe College on this. And we will have an exciting keynote speaker. We'll have numerous virtual breakout sessions on a variety of topics. You'll be able to choose different things that you might want to participate in, and you'll be able to, this subject matter experts will be in the rooms and speaking on those topics, and you'll be able to engage in smaller numbers with those subject matter experts for that. And last but not least, I'd like to invite you, anyone who is interested in becoming a member of the coalition. We are now ready to have you join the coalition. So I'm just going to show you so just go to our website, and we now have on our website, we have a membership tab, and you can choose what kind of membership you want. We are not charging membership fees because of COVID recovery. Membership in the coalition will be free and for the first year. And if you are not local London area, please still consider joining, because we are the coalition of Ontario. And so we can engage you at a distance through our Zoom events. So we have 3 different models. We have the individual membership model, a business membership model, and organization or not-for-profit membership model. So please go to our website, which I did put in the chat. The link to the website is the very first thing in the chat if you scroll up. And we would love to see you joining as members so that we can hear your voice. You can be part of the change. So we really appreciate you attending, and we hope that you will all be back next month for July. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening.